Chapter 18. John locked the door to the storage room behind him, his heart feeling like it was going to beat out of his chest wall, his head trying to process what just happened. Kissing her was like nothing he'd ever experienced. She was so small, but so powerful at the same time. He had gently ended their kiss, even as his body screamed at him not to continue it, to see where it went. But he didn't want to take advantage of her. So he had left. Just like that, like he didn't want to stay with her forever. Say what you want about Dimitri, but his training and self-control really works, he thought to himself as he walked into the kitchen, the first aid kits and the dinner tray piled in his arms. He put away the first aid kits and started to clean the dishes, barely noticing what he was doing as he thought back to what had happened when he had walked into the storage room earlier and seen her lying in a heap on the ground. His stomach had dropped to the ground. She was clutching her stomach, her tied hand bruised and bloody. He had rushed to help her as much as he could, attending to her wounds and putting a cooling pack on her bruises. He had apologized to her for Dimitri's behavior as they sat there together, trying to keep her spirits up by engaging her in conversation and telling her about himself. For the first time in his life, he had found himself telling someone about how he'd come to live at Dimitri's compound, about how scared he'd been when he first got there. She had comforted him, and for the first time since they'd met, she had reached out and touched him. When she had put her head on his shoulder, his heart had soared, and when she had turned her face up to his and leaned in, pressing those impossibly soft lips against his, he found that he had no will to move. If he could, he would have stretched that moment out forever. In all his life, John had never had someone he cared about. The members of Dimitri's team were bound together through duty, loyalty, and training, but he didn't think any one of them would miss him if he disappeared tomorrow. Naomi was different. Whenever he saw her, his stomach would do a little flip, and her scent was the best thing he'd ever smelled. It hadn't started out that way, but at some point over the last couple of days he'd started to have some very non-friend-like feelings for her. When he sat with her and talked to her, it felt like he was just a guy talking to just a girl. Of course, it was the furthest thing from the truth. But at those moments he could forget the situation they were in and just talk to her. As the days went by, he had started looking forward to talking to her every day, to trying to understand what it was that made her tick. When she'd told him about her childhood in Sanguine, about how she used to sneak out with her friends, he had realized for the first time in his life what he'd missed out on living with Dimitri in the compound. She'd lived a life that was so much richer than his. He'd even begun taking his time preparing her food now. It had been pretty plain fare to begin with, and he really didn't have much to work with in the cabin, but he'd found some brown sugar in one of the bags as well as some spices. At least that way he could vary her food a little from day to day. The fog she'd created in his mind cleared up by the time he'd put away the dishes, and the only thing that was left was anger. Pure, unadulterated anger. There was no other way to put it. He was fuming. How could Dimitri have hurt her like that? He'd never thought Dimitri was that kind of person. It was true that Dimitri had no loyalties, but that was different from having no ethics. John wasn't a stupid man. He knew that Andre wasn't planning to throw her a welcome home party. He wanted to make an example of her, to use her as a lesson to show the rest of his pack that there was no escaping him. John knew that. But this? Attacking her when she was defenseless? She was the only one in this whole affair who could even marginally be called innocent. She'd decided the direction of her own life, decided that she didn't want to stand by and watch her friend suffering at the hands of a dictatorial father, and now she was paying the price. What was she here for? To satisfy an old man's ego. A protective instinct welled up inside him, something ancient and beyond conscious thought. There was a part of him that hoped that he could keep Naomi safe, but could he really? He had no control over what Dimitri and Andre were going to do to her. He tried to put the thought from his mind and focus on preparing the things he'd need for tomorrow. It was what he'd been trained to do, to make sure that everything was prepared, checked, and secure, and to not ask too many questions. He was the perfect soldier for Dimitri, trained to use his every sense to detect when something was going wrong. He could tell by a sniff in the air if something was off. He finished the checks he needed to do, made sure the windows and door were secure, and made sure that there were no intruders in the woods around the cabin. almost hoping that he would find someone there, a spy or something. There was a pressure in his gut that needed to be released, and he could do with someone to punch right now. But there was no one, and the fevered prickle of rage all over his body wasn't letting up. For the first time in his life, John began to think of what it would be like to say no to Dimitri, to leave everything behind like Naomi had been brave enough to do. He was lost in thought when he heard a car outside. Dimitri. Heavy boots came clomping up the stairs, and the door burst open. Puppy, where are you? Dimitri shouted. Here, John said automatically, standing up from the chair in the living room. With a sigh, Dimitri looked at him with all the interest someone would take in a rock on the side of the road. Andre says he's going to be back soon. He wants her at his house. Start getting ready to move our guest, he said. He started taking off his coat and gloves and reached into his pocket for his cigarettes. He was halfway through lighting one when he noticed that John hadn't replied yet. What's wrong with you? He snapped. Why are we moving her? John asked, ignoring Dimitri's question. Something in his brain nagged at him. If they were going to move her, would he still be able to protect her? And wasn't that what he wanted to do when it came down to it? Protect her instead of follow Dimitri's orders? It was strange to admit it to himself, but he wanted to protect her, really wanted to protect her. It hit him square in the stomach. He cared about her. Dimitri's eyes narrowed. I said, get ready to move her. That's your order. Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. John watched him, trying to stop himself from saying exactly what he wanted to say. He watched his boss standing there, cigarette in his mouth, his normal, self-satisfied look on his face, and his restraint failed him. You said you weren't going to hurt her, he said. Dimitri looked impassively at him. So what? So? You went in there and beat her up, replied John. Dimitri's face didn't change at all. Again, puppy, I must ask you, so what? She was defenseless, John shouted. He'd only shouted at Dimitri once or twice before in his life, and both times he'd barely come out of it alive, but he didn't care. John hadn't had many people in his life that he would defend. To Dimitri like this, it was a shocking realization that Naomi was someone he could put into that category. Dimitri looked John up and down, sizing him up like he always did before a big fight. He blew a plume of smoke into John's face. You need to watch how you're talking to me, he hissed. John didn't flinch. You shouldn't have touched her, Dimitri. You're going to have to explain it to Andre. He paused. And attacking someone incapacitated by silver? You're better than that. It was impertinence of the highest order, and John's whole body was telling him to head for the door. But he stood his ground. Whatever was coming his way, he was going to face it. Do you want to repeat yourself? Said Dimitri. You always taught us that we were the best of the best, Dimitri. I just don't think that beating up a woman who's tied up with silver is something that someone like you should be doing, said John. Dimitri ashed his cigarette on the arm of the couch, put it back in his mouth, and then punched John in the stomach without warning. John doubled over, the breath knocked out of his body. Stars exploded in front of his eyes as pain raced through his body. Dimitri crouched over him. You think you can lecture me, puppy? He whispered. He wrenched John's head up by his hair and landed a heavy blow square on his nose. It was like being hit by a truck. John's head couldn't hold itself up anymore, and he collapsed onto the ground, pain radiating through all parts of his body. The floor was cool on his skin, but the relief was only momentary when heat started flooding through him, with warm blood rushing to his wounds and pouring onto the floor. Dimitri stood over him. Who do you think you are? Hard boots landed square on the middle of John's abdomen. Metallic blood pooled in his mouth. Two more kicks landed in rapid succession, one on his stomach again, the other against his curled legs. Dimitri moved too fast to allow John to respond. Dimitri was well trained, and he knew how to land blows with maximum effect before his victim even knew they'd been hit. John had been on the receiving end more than once, and experience did not make it easier. Dimitri wrenched John's head back by his hair and bared his throat. His wolf flashed yellow and vicious in his eyes, and his teeth elongated and sharpened. You fool! What do you think you're going to do here? You think you're going to save your little friend in there? I knew you were weak. You're a disgrace. He leaned closer to John's face, peering deep into his eyes. Oh, I get it. Now, you've been spending so much time with her that you've started to have feelings for her. That's it, isn't it? You've started to feel sorry for her. And you think if you step up to me that I'll what? Apologize and release her. He roared deep in his throat, the rumbling cutting through John's broken body. John struggled to keep his eyes open. I knew you were weak. You spent a couple of days with this woman and you think you can talk to me any way you want? You're nothing, he hissed. Blows rained down on John's body. Wave after wave of pain broke over him, and he gave in. He let his head fall forward, let his eyes close. Dimitri's voice reached him like he was standing on the other end of a tunnel. Know your place, Dimitri hissed. He let John drop onto the floor, took the key to the storage room off his keychain and started dragging John out of the living room. John's head was bumping on the floor, his whole body aching. His thoughts came through a haze of pain. Even as the darkness started to close in, he had one thought over and over: they had to get out of there. They both had to get out of there. Chapter 19. Naomi. Naomi jolted awake. The door was opening loudly again. The sound of the same boots as before came into the room. Naomi lay as still as she could. As long as she stayed still, she had a chance of escaping this encounter unscathed. He was dragging something into the room behind him. It looked heavy and even Dimitri was struggling to pull it along. He hauled it into the room and heaved it into the corner furthest away from her. She couldn't see what the bundle was. Dimitri turned on his heel and left the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't give Naomi a second glance. She breathed a sigh of relief and turned her attention to the bundle in the corner. The shape of it seemed strangely familiar, but in the darkness she couldn't see exactly what it was. The pain in her stomach and her hand had subsided, probably thanks to the painkillers John had given her, and her mind wasn't as foggy as it had been before. A sliver of moonlight was coming in through the window and fell right onto the bundle, and Naomi realized to her horror that the bundle was moving. It was breathing. Naomi shrank back into her corner. There was another person in the room with her. Naomi wished with all her might that she could call for John, but with Dimitri lurking around out there, she couldn't risk it. Her skin went ice cold as she watched the bundle. Whoever it was twitched from time to time, but for the most part they lay stock still. Suddenly the bundle groaned and twitched. It looked like it was trying to get, but it was obviously in pain. Naomi gathered her courage and called out, Hey, are you okay? There was something familiar about the clothes the person was wearing, and as Naomi tried to examine them in the faint wisp of moonlight coming through the window, the person succeeded in flipping themselves over so she could see their face. An icy tendril wended its way through her heart. It was John. John was the bundle. How could this have happened? He was fine just an hour ago. He'd walked out of the room, locked the door behind him, and then what? Had Dimitri done this to him? John, she whispered. He didn't hear her. John. Her voice was louder this time, but it still didn't seem like he could hear her. She looked him over as best as she could in the dim light. His face was covered with blood. There were cuts on his face and on his scalp, bleeding profusely. To her horror, she realized that blood was also trickling out of his mouth. That could mean internal bleeding. Naomi was horrified. As John started stirring more, a little hope sprang into her heart. John! She called again. He groaned in response. She looked around the room, frustrated that she couldn't tend to his wounds as he had to hers. Then, like a miracle, she spotted a small wall box underneath the corner of her blanket. It was a first aid kit that John must have forgotten earlier. She grabbed it and wrenched the lid open. There wasn't much in there, just some adhesive bandages, a small piece of gauze, a small pair of scissors, and various ointments. Not exactly what the doctor used if he was treating internal bleeding, but it was all she had. She was using the scissors in the kit to cut some pieces off her blanket when she heard him whisper, Naomi. His voice was like a balm to her soul. Hey, I'm here, she said. You're going to be okay. She kept at her task. She was going to need something to staunch the flow of blood. John, can you hear me? She said. She had to keep him talking and awake. I can hear you, he said, his voice so weak that she found herself trying to hold back tears. She fashioned the scraps of fabric into pads and stretched as far as she could towards him, the rope around her legs binding her to the wall. She only just reached him. John, can you try to move closer? She asked. She couldn't put enough pressure on his head wound from this far away. I need to put pressure on your head, but I can't reach you. I need you to move. I didn't know you were so bossy, he said, and Naomi smiled in relief. He was joking with her. He was going to be fine, right? He slowly shuffled over to her. It was hard going, but he managed to get himself in a position where she could reach his head and put pressure on it. Seeing him up close, his face looked a lot worse than it had before, and she had to suppress a sob. She turned her attention to her work, pressing the makeshift gauze against his wounds, trying to stop the blood that was flowing a little too freely for her liking. She didn't allow herself to think of anything other than the task at hand. Thank you, he whispered, clutching her wrist as she worked on him. She couldn't stop the tear that fell down her cheek and onto his face. Looking at him lying here, the most vulnerable she'd ever seen him, she knew for sure that there was something else to her feelings for him, something more than friendship. But now wasn't the time nor the place to explore that. You're going to be okay, she whispered. She didn't know anything about medicine. Putting pressure on bleeding wounds was about the extent of her knowledge, so they sat there for hours, her blood-soaked hands pressing against his skin, trying to keep the blood where it damn well belonged. At some point, John fell asleep, his eyelids twitching and his head turning this way and that. Naomi didn't sleep a wink. She kept her eyes open and watched John's pale face for any signs of distress. The night dragged onwards into day, and finally, Naomi saw the rays of the first sunshine coming through the high windows. What happened? John croaked as he woke up. I don't know. You tell me, she said while caressing his head. Dimitri just dumped you in here and took off again. I don't know what happened before that. The bleeding had completely stopped. She brushed his hair away from his forehead to feel if he had a fever. So far so good. Dimitri happened, John said with some effort. She gently took his hand in hers, and he latched onto her like a drowning man. To a life preserver. His mouth was opening and closing like he wanted to say something but just couldn't manage the words. What's wrong? We have to get out of here, he whispered. His eyes were getting more alert. Now, I'll get you out of here, and if I can, I'm coming with you. Naomi wasn't sure what to say, so she settled for just holding his hand tighter. John had never said anything about leaving Dimitri. In fact, he'd repeatedly said that he couldn't. She strangled the thread of hope that started in her stomach. He wouldn't be saying any of this if he weren't in a lot of pain. Once the pain subsided, he would probably go back to Dimitri. You don't believe me? His voice was full of disappointment. He struggled to sit up. Come on, stay lying down. I don't think your head can handle sitting upright. Now, Naomi said as she pushed him back down. But he fought her and won, and eventually, he leaned up against the wall beside her. John's eyes were bleary and his eyelids swollen, but he looked her in the eyes with all the sincerity in the world. I know you don't believe me, and I know why, he said. You think that because I said I couldn't leave Dimitri before, that I won't leave him now. But that's not true. I'm getting you out of here. And if I'm still alive after that, I'm coming with you. John, you can't go anywhere in this condition, she said. We're stuck here. And there's no way out. I should know, I've been in this room a while. John took her hand again and took a deep breath, wincing with pain. I know that we didn't start off in the right way, he said. This is not how I thought I'd ever make a friend, let alone meet someone I trust the way I trust you. And I need you to trust me now. I'm going to get you out of here. I'm not going to let them hurt you anymore. Naomi couldn't stop the tears falling from her eyes now. At that moment she believed him, believed that he was going to get them out of there despite the hopelessness of their situation. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, trying to put every ounce of trust, happiness, and feeling that she had for him into it. It wasn't love, what she was feeling, but it was something dangerously close to it. She gently pulled his head down to her shoulder and ran her hands through his hair, hoping to soothe him enough to fall asleep again. The more rest he got, the better he'd heal. By the time John woke up again, his advanced healing had kicked in. Even though his whole body was a mottled collage of bruises and cuts, he looked much better. She could see that it still hurt him to walk, but he was awake. He was talking and he seemed mostly all right. He undid the knots that were binding her legs, allowing her to get up and walk. For the first time in days. She nearly fell over, but the imbalance didn't last long. Just like riding a bike, she said as she pranced around the room, John laughing along with her. As she sat back down beside him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, she felt the exhaustion of going an entire night without sleep. She put her head on his shoulder. I really like this, he said to her. You know, sitting here with you. Would have been fine with not having to be beaten up to do it, but whatever. Naomi smiled, punching him lightly in the arm, then looking him in the eye. Are you sure you want to try to leave? She asked. Yeah. I told you I'd get you out of here and I'm going to, he replied. He ran a hand over her hair. I'm not breaking my promise. I'm getting you home. What are you planning to do? How are we getting out? She asked. He grinned, his handsome smile only a little altered by the beating he'd taken. Just the way you got here. Through the front door. She shook her head. That is just a dumbass idea, man. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm your friend and I have to tell you. You don't know Dimitri like I do, he said. It doesn't occur to him that I could disobey him and just walk out of here. You see, he's used to absolute obedience from everyone around him. Not that any of us have ever tried to prove him wrong. This is just his idea of a punishment, beating the hell out of me and throwing me in here. It's always like this. Right now he's probably just biding his time until he calls me out of here and puts me on guard duty again. So you mean that after everything, he'd actually let you work for him again? Naomi was aghast. Dimitri had beaten John to a pulp and now there was a possibility that he would want him back? I find that hard to believe. He took her hand and smiled. Oh, ye of little faith. Just wait until you're free and then you'll believe me. She leaned her head on his shoulder again. I just don't want to go without you. I'm definitely leaving with you, he said, but I don't know where I'm going to go after that. She fell quiet, her eyes taking on a faraway look that he couldn't read. She stayed like that for a while, until she murmured something he couldn't hear. What did you say? He asked. Come to Fell with me. You can live on the farm and Rex would be happy to have someone with your skills helping him out. No alpha is going to want me near their pack after everything I've done. She took his hand, her thumb rubbing his in a comforting gesture. That's not true. I can talk to him and Allie's fiancé Ben can too. He's one of Rex's close friends. We can convince him to let you join. John huffed with laughter. And you think that you would be safe then? Dimitri wouldn't hesitate to kill you just to get back at me. He hurts people for fun. Me hanging around you after this. I don't think it's a good idea. Naomi pushed herself up and stared down at him. What are you saying? I'm saying that after I get you out of here, and get you home safely that I'm going to go somewhere else for a while. Even if he does come after us, you'll have Rex's protection, and I'll be somewhere far enough away that he won't hurt you to get to me. And what will happen to you if he finds you? She asked.